Culturally, I'm Ailey. Today's video is about the history of Samhain. What is Samhain? Where did it come from? Isn't it just pagan Halloween? Samhain is the Gaelic word for November, and it's sometimes used to refer to the festivities held on the 31st of October in Gaelic-speaking areas. For over 1,000 years, those festivities have been part of the larger Christian holiday of Halloween, originally a mass to pray for all saints and the souls of the recently departed. Because Halloween and Samhain have been interlinked for so long, and because the Gaelic Samhain traditions had a strong influence on how America developed its Halloween traditions, a lot of people think that if you keep stripping the Christianity out of Halloween, eventually you will hit something authentically pagan. However, even if this was possible, which probably it isn't if we're honest, by starting with this end goal, we start with a set of expectations that can distract us from the interesting evidence we do have about what the pre-Christian Samhain may have been. So, let us set aside modern Halloween and simply focus on the glimmers we can see in the historical sources. The history is murky. We can catch vague glimpses through the old Gaelic texts of a time of year steeped in politics, a time of change, and the echo of a sacred holiday where offerings were made to the old gods. What was the pre-Christian Samhain? Part 1. The Celtic New Year. When I was a kid on the Isle of Man, the idea that Samhain, or Hopchine as we called it, the idea that it was the Celtic New Year was something that was often stated as just an absolute commonly known fact. However, where this idea comes from is something that has been and can be debated. There is something really poetic about counting the year in November as the last of the autumn leaves fall. It's also reminiscent of how in Caesar's account of the Gauls, he talks about how they count their days from sundown, meaning their days start in the night. Perhaps their year started in the night too. It's key to remember that Samhain is a Gaelic word, which only affects a very small slither of the broader Celtic diaspora. Is there any evidence of its importance outside of Gaelic-speaking regions? Whilst there are folk traditions across Britain and other Celtic areas, there is nothing concrete in those traditions that can help us date these. And honestly, most of them probably did just arise out of the folk and Christian traditions of Halloween. The best suggestion we have that this time of year may have been important to a Celtic group other than the Gaelic-speaking areas is a find called the Coligny calendar. This bloody incredible find was dug up in 1897 in France. It depicts a 5-year calendar and has marked out what days would be lucky and what days would be unlucky. The calendar itself dates back to the 2nd century CE, which is when Gaul was under the Roman Empire. So what's interesting for the was Samhain celebrated outside of Ireland question is the fact the calendar splits the year into 2 halves. The Sam, essentially the summer, and the Gam, which is essentially the winter. The Sam lines up with the Gaelic Beltane and the start of Gam with the Gaelic Samhain. However, the new year in this calendar, it's counted at the summer, so Beltane, rather than the winter. We also have the fact that the first month of summer is called Samanos, which sounds a lot like Samhain, and indeed they have the same root origin of summer, with Samhain probably meaning the end of summer. However, May and November are very, very different months, and just because the word for the Gaulish May and the word for the Gaelic November sound so similar, it doesn't mean that those months had the same ritual purpose to the people living in those times. Personally, I don't think there's strong evidence of a pan-Celtic New Year starting in November. However, what is useful is this calendar, as I say, divided the year into 2, and this is something we do see echoed in the Gaelic texts. The year is often split into 2, with the Fianna warriors acting as protecting soldiers from Samhain to Beltane, and then independent hunters from Beltane to Samhain. Cuchulainn protected Ulster from Samhain to Beltane before he had to do some healing. And then we have the storytellers, bards and druids. They would stay with a certain king from Samhain to Beltane. So this year, splitting in half, that may have been something pan-Celtic. But some of you might be thinking, even if it isn't the Celtic New Year, couldn't it have just been the Gaelic one? The only thing that I could find in the Gaelic text that would support this came from the Annals of the Four Masters, which is a relatively late text that aimed to document the history of Ireland. It mentions the figure Tigelmas, who died at the end of the year. And then later on, it then explicitly states that he died at Samhain. And that would suggest that Samhain could have been seen as the end of the old year, and therefore the start of the new one. The fact that the writer felt the need to clarify this could indicate that Samhain as the new year wasn't something widely believed in 16th century Ireland. It could also mean that maybe he was joining together different stories about Tigelmas, one that explicitly stated he died at the end of the year, and another where it explicitly stated that he died at Samhain, and then wove those stories together in the text, creating the implication that Samhain is the end of the year. However, it does stand as a piece of evidence that it could have been seen as the Gaelic New Year, and how strong you find that I'm going to leave to you. For me, regardless of whether or not it was when the year was counted, the evidence is very strong that it was seen as important because it was the time of year where the cold half of the year began. And this key insight that Samhain falls as the year is getting long and cold and we're entering in this darker half of the year, that might be the foundation to everything else. Part 2. The Feasts of Kings. In Old Ireland, 3 days before the start of Samhain Eve, and 3 days after, every 7 years there was the Feast of Tuired. This was an assembly of Ireland where the kings gathered to make their pledges to the High King. It was a time for feasting, for stories to be told, for fortunes to be made, for laws to be read, for feats of strength and other displays of revelry. It was a time of coming together and probably a very fun time as well. Importantly, it was a time of year when the harvest had already come in and when the cattle herds had been slaughtered down to their winter grazing numbers. This means there's a lot of fresh meat going around, and there's also a lot of fresh vegetables that won't last through winter storages, making it a really good time of year for just feasting a lot and throwing a good bash. Importantly in all of this, though, is it's a time of year where the hard work of the spring and summer farming would have come to fruition and been known, and the kings proving to their various warriors under them that they would be able to provide them with good food. So a key detail that we need to bear in mind as we go forward is that time and time again in the Gaelic texts, we see that the quality of a king is assessed by how well the people under him do and how abundant the harvest is. I mean, the logic is fairly simple. Good king makes good judgments. We have a year of prosperity. Poor king makes terrible judgments. We have a year of suffering. As such, when we think about these celebrations being held, where various kings of Ireland are bestowing gifts on the High King and throwing feasts, we can frame this as an assessment of the fitness of kings and of their High Kings. With the harvest in, everyone had a good idea of how hard the upcoming winter was going to be. Not only was this a time essentially to pay taxes to the High King by giving the share of the herd that is owed to him, it was also a time of year where it would be made starkly clear that they were a poor leader. This idea of kings changing also shows up in the text in that an awful lot of kings seem to die around Samhain in the Gaelic texts. And maybe that this is an echo of the idea that not only was it a time where kingship was tested, perhaps it was a time when kingship was ended. One of the most interesting and compelling Gaelic myths is about overthrowing wrongful rulers around the time of Samhain. It's the Second Battle of Moytirra. The Tuired, or the gods, are meeting to overthrow a bad king who's been abusing his power to the point that so many of them are starving. Meanwhile, this bad king, Bresh, is consolidating his own power by calling on the aid of the supernatural people his father was from, the Fomorians. In the weeks leading up to Samhain, we find the Tuired plotting for his overthrow. Then we have the arrival of the god Lu, a new figure who would take up the role of kingship and lead them to victory. And then we have the god, the Dagda, who is also heavily associated with the idea of Gaelic kingship. He is also going around making alliances with supernatural women, which includes the Morrigan, which makes a very famous story of how they shared their bed this time of year. It can be a temptation to see the Battle of Moytirra as one of many stories of new gods rising up to overthrow the old in a very primordial, good versus chaos kind of way. But the Celticist John Carey, in his lecture, The Wanderings of the Battle of Moytirra, makes the insightful point that this story was written down in a time when the Irish were facing rulership from Scandinavian colonists. Their lack of knowledge and respect for the Irish way of life echoes how Bresh acts in the story. We can see that the mythological elements, being the deities, they are being used to talk about a real political situation being faced by the monks writing this story down. The story doesn't have to be ancient to hold the shard of something integral to us. It doesn't have to be about big primordial conflicts. By framing the pains, injustices, and brutality that the people of Ireland were facing as something to also be played out by the gods, the story shifts us into noticing how deeply important good rule is. We all know that poor leadership by governments can have disastrous effects on the lives of its people. And yet day-to-day grievances can also be painted as small in the shadow of the big things a country can face, like wars. But it's these day-to-day grievances that called the gods to take action. By giving the constant suffering and day-to-day struggles to the gods of their past, The Christian monks in this time period were highlighting that it's this day-to-day suffering that the sacred is concerned with. This story works as a satire, and it reminds us that the constant battle against bad leadership, broken promises, and the desire to make the world better, that's the important stuff. It is real, and divine concerns lie in what is real. So, the Second Battle of Moytirra reinforces Samhain as a time when the Gaels formed alliances that would get them through the winter, and potentially even take down the corrupt leaders that threatened their survival. It can be tempting, as we're framing it this way, to start seeing it as more and more of a secular thing, as something that was just about practical politics. But the spiritual and the everyday aren't discrete, neat, separate things, but rather they are entwined and woven together. And we do have evidence that this wasn't just seen as a time of political change, but also of spiritual. I'm going to illustrate this with, of all things, the stories of Cruach. As a literary figure, he is an idol or a god that shows up in the Gaelic texts to illustrate the evils of paganism. We have in many stories, including the Book of Invasions, this idea that at Samhain time, the ancient Gaels gathered on a hill to offer him a horrific sacrifice so that he wouldn't harm them going into the winter. And he is framed explicitly as a bad leader, as someone who was demanding too much of his people. It was actually at this sacrifice I'm talking about that the figure from earlier, High King Tigernas, is meant to have died. These sacrifices and this suffering was meant to have continued right up until the point St. Patrick destroyed Cruach's golden idol with a sledgehammer. Like with the kings, the pledges being made to Cruach at Samhain was a way of aligning with him and trying to get his protection through the winter. By destroying him, like the overthrow of false kings, St. Patrick allowed the Gaels to instead trust their safety to Jesus, who didn't demand this evil sacrifice. Personally, I believe the story is making use of the same narrative that bad leaders lead to bad times in order to talk about the old religion and the new. The old religion, the one that tends to concern Celtic pagans the most, is being framed as something that was poor and leading to suffering, and the arrival of the new, Christianity, was the thing that would set the people free. What we can see is that the importance of making offerings to the gods at Samhain was important enough to the Gaels that even the Christian god had to fit into it. So if Samhain is also about the role of the divine as we go into winter, are there any other insights we can gain from the stories that are more to do with the gods? Part 3. The spiritual. Another old story is a story of how the god Angus MacOg became the ruler of the She-Hill Newgrange. To do this, we are going to have to do a very quick and not at all detailed enough rundown of the She in order for the rest of what I say to make sense. So strap in. A brief introduction to the She. She is Gaelic for mound and also for peace. The She mounds are associated in Ireland with fair folk in modern folklore, who are sometimes referred to as the Aes She or the people in the mound. The term Aes She also shows up in the Irish texts. However, there is a lot of difference in how the early medieval texts paint the Aes She and how the Aes She are seen in modern folklore. So to make things simple, I'm going to refer to the beings in folklore as the fair folk or good neighbours, and I'm going to refer to the beings in the medieval texts as the Aes She. These Aes She, which means people of the mounds, included many figures who lived in these mounds, including the Gaelic gods. The mounds, as well as some lakes and also maybe the sea and other geographical features like the occasional cave, they're seen as connections to the other world, which also very much in brief is essentially the land where the fair folk or the Aes She live, and it's often typified in stories by time acting differently. Okay, that should be enough, I think, to keep going. So, end of tangent. So, the story of Angus MacOg winning Newgrange has several versions, but one shows up in the 8th or 9th century in the story The Wooing of Adain. So, the god, Angus MacOg, receives advice from his father, the Dagda, on how he, Angus, can become the ruler of Newgrange in the Boyne Valley. Newgrange is perhaps the most important of the She mounds, and by receiving it as its halls, it elevates Angus as having really important status. The plan is simple. He is to go inside the hill on Samhain, because the hills are open on Samhain, and its current leader, Alcma, will be unarmed, like everybody on Samhain night. Angus is to be armed, and he is then to threaten that he will only let Alcma go with his life if Alcma agrees to let him rule the She for a day and a night. Alcmer does this. And when Alcmer returns the next day to claim back his throne from Angus for this day and this night, Angus refuses to give up the throne. Alcmer takes the matter before the Dagda, and the Dagda rules that since the world is lived in days and nights, when Alcmer said that he would give up his kingship for a day and a night, he gave up his kingship for the Sidhe. But don't worry, to make things fair, the Dagda assigns him to a different Sidhe hill, so he's not left homeless. What's spiritually significant is that this story gives us the impression that Samhain is a time of change even within the spiritual. Even a deity's relationship with the land can change. What gods have influence over what can shift. What gods seen as more powerful than others can also change. New Grange is the most important mound, and Angus taking it over from Alcmer indicates that he is now an important figure. Hierarchies shift. It tells us the gods aren't static, and that this liminal time in the mortal world can also be seen as a liminal time in the other. But it isn't just the affairs of the gods acting in isolation, and we can see a mingling of the affairs of the mortals and the affairs of the Sidhe is also a theme of Samhain. Another type of story that shows up a lot can be illustrated by The Adventure of Nera, where one Samhain, the warrior Nera hears whispers of a house that's very strange. He investigates this house, and the story laces it with otherworld symbolism. Nera meets a woman and beds her, and discovers that she is a member of the Sidhe. After bedding her, she tells him of the horrible things that will happen to him unless he destroys the Sidhe mound by next Samhain. He does, crisis averted, and his fate is changed. This particular pattern of someone entering into the otherworld via a Sidhe mound that is open on Samhain, then falling in love with an Sidhe woman and forming an alliance with her, is a really common type of tale. And like the Angus story, it makes use of the idea that through the Sidhe hills, the otherworld is accessible. A lot of people see this as evidence of the thinning of the veil. This is a concept that comes to us through spiritualism and mediumship. It's very much this idea that the living and the dead are separated by a metaphysical veil, and that spiritualism is about crossing the veil so you can talk to the dead. It is not an idea that originally came from these stories about the Sidhe mounts, and using it as the way to explore why the other world is accessible, it can be a bit misleading. Rather than a metaphysical fabric that separates the living and the dead, what we see in the Irish stories is the idea of this world and the other simultaneously existing, simultaneously entwined. And there's often the implication that to the Sidhe, these two worlds are intermingled and one. A good example of this can be seen in the story The Voyage of Bran, where Bran meets the god Manannan out in the sea, and Manannan talks about how he can ride across the sea in a chariot, because to him, the sea is a meadow, but Bran can't see it that way because he is mortal. In these Samhain stories, no fabric has been destroyed or thinned. There's nothing that has to be pushed through. Instead, the mounds are referred to explicitly as being open. And the other world in these stories is now physically real to mortals, the way it always is to the Sidhe. This intermingling is also meant to happen twice a year, at Samhain and also at Beltane, these two thresholds to the two halves of the year. I want to be very clear. When I say physically real, I am talking about that within the context of the story. I do not hold that you can walk into the other world on Samhain. Instead, what's going on in the other world is something that at Samhain and at Beltane, humans too can influence. The decisions we make this time of year are not just about the practical, but actively affect the spiritual as well. This entering into the other world through Sidhe mounds, this getting advice from a Sidhe woman, these stories set at Samhain ground us back again in the personal and the individual. The changes in the other world aren't just about political shifts within the gods or about changes of roles, but also a shift in how they relate to us and a shift that people can actively be a part of. If we tie together this moving of the gods, the pledges made to Cronkrúig, and this idea that people are getting advice from the Sidhe in the other world, we find this idea that we can build reciprocity with those that we're going into the winter with. This is a really important spiritual idea and shows that Samhain is not just some secular holiday about practical political alliances, but a deeply spiritual one, setting us up for the year to come. Part 4. So what about us? How do these ideas affect us as modern pagans, where many of us don't have to worry about giving tributes to kings or hoping that our feasting stores last through the winter? What does a religious Samhain look like to a modern Gaelic or Celtic polytheist? We have seen that this is a time of change, a time for forming alliances for seeking protection and also for seeking wisdom. Whilst our concerns and the rhythms in our lives are very different to those of the pre-Christian Irish, the fact that we face major changes in our lives, that is a human universal. Change remains. I don't think there's ever going to be one right way to do things. But what I thought I'd do is talk to you all a little bit about how all of that has influenced my own practice. On the 31st of October, once the sun has begun to go down, I approach my altar, which I have decorated and cleaned, and I make offerings and I celebrate the gods that have been a big part of my life this year. I do the same for the non-gods and for the ancestors and the spirits. I give them offerings and I acknowledge that the year rolls on. When I do this, I am accepting that maybe they won't actually be a part of my life in the year to come. I then call out to and reflect on the deities that I want to build relationships with. I give them offerings too. I call out to deities who've not really been a part of my life before. I acknowledge them and I thank them for their role in the universe. Again, there are offerings, there are libations, and I reflect on maybe how some of them will come to be integral parts of what's happening in my future. Essentially, for me, Samhain is a time to open the door to my hearth cult. This is what I frame my ritual around, about talking to deities who are part of my life and to the ones who might be a part of my life, and acknowledging that that can change on either end. I think one normal and unspoken about part of modern polytheism is that a lot of us face the sense that the gods you feel close to and called to changes as we journey through life. Whilst not universal, this feeling is normal. And for me, letting one of the most sacred days of the year be an acknowledgement and even a celebration of that feels deeply meaningful, and it helps me embrace those changes as I embrace the changes coming from the winter. It also helps me notice and celebrate my evolving relationships with deities who've been a constant presence in my hearth cult for years. It's amazing how different, deep, and rich some of these connections feel compared to when I first started building reciprocity with them. Giving them offerings and celebrating this growth in our relationship is also something I am so glad I have made space for. This is not the only way to approach these themes. There isn't one true way to practice sincere spirituality, just as the Gaels found sacred in the political roles of the kings. Just as the folk traditions of Ireland have celebrated this day-to-day renewal of luck at Samhain, there are many ways that we too can embrace this time of change. There are many ways that we can take stock and wonder at all we have in this world and in our lives. I hope whatever changes you find in the year to come take you kindly, and that you are able to find the friendships and alliances you need to flourish in the world as it changes and evolves around you. And with that, I think it's time I wound this video to a close. Some of you might have noticed that this has been my first video in quite a while. And as such, let's be honest, I am not expecting the algorithm to bless this video. If you would like to bless it instead, please click the like button. And share this video in spaces where people need to forge a new relationship with how they perceive Samhain. And if you want my videos to come with you into the year to come, please click subscribe. Thank you all, and take care.